Hello and welcome to another historical video. My name is Sam Frick, founder and editor at Around the Northeast Corner, and today we're going to actually start diving into the history of what would essentially become the Northeast state today. But before we can talk about the Northeast state, we must first talk about a conference that would innovate and evolve to the conference that it became back then. It was revolutionary ahead of its time, and in an era where conferences really weren't at the level that you see today. The NEIAC was one of the original modern day conferences to evolve high school athletics as we know it. And so without further ado, we're going to take a look at the first of a two-part series diving deep into the Northeastern Indiana Athletic Conference, which existed from 1927 until 1989. So, where did it all begin? It began in the 1927-28 school year with the formation of the NEIAC. It was originally known as the Northeastern Indiana Conference, or the NEIC. Some people called it the NEI, but right around towards the 60s, eventually it was adopted as the NEIAC. 8 counties were a part of that first year of the new conference, and we'll talk about the schools in a moment, because one thing we want to mention with the NEIC, when it came in 1927, it came in the same time as the NIC. It was just the 4th modern-day high school athletics conference ever for the IHSAA. We do not count the county pods because those are not really conferences. What we're talking about here are the type of conference structures that exist to this day, and that's your 4th modern-day high school conference. And as you can see, the NIC, the North Central Conference, and the South Lake Michigan Conference came before it. The original members of the NEIC included Angola, Auburn, Bluffton, Columbia City, Decatur, Fort Wayne Central, Fort Wayne Northside, Fort Wayne Southside, Garrett, Huntington, and Kendallville. All these schools, roughly half of those schools, are going to still be a part of a conference together to this day. We will talk more about that as we move further along in the historical videos regarding the NEIC, the NHC, and the NEA. Looking at its early history, 1927, the conference fielded football, boys basketball, baseball, and boys track and field for the first time. Southside won the first football and basketball titles in that first year. Fort Wayne Central won the first baseball and track titles. As you can see on the screen, the first photo you're seeing is the first baseball trophy for the conference. I believe the trophy to the right was the track conference championship. The second photo down, you'll see the one on the left being the first football conference trophy. As the years go by, it would be a lot larger of a trophy. And then the one in the middle, because of Fort Wayne Central's and Fort Wayne Northside and Southside's commitment to like the city series and whatnot, there was a trophy just for the city tournament, and that's the trophy you're seeing in the middle on the second photo. Huntington, Auburn, and Central had won sectional titles in track predating the conference's existence. Central won the first track sectional as a conference school in 1928 and 1929. Northside won 6 track sectionals as a conference member between 1930 and 1939. By 1928, Southside's Richard Bell became the first individual state champion from the conference, winning the 880-yard run, which is an event that no longer exists today. Auburn and Fort Wayne Central football then proceeded by sharing the next 2 football conference titles in 1928 and 1929. Southside repeated in 1929 for basketball. Huntington won the first of their 2 conference titles in 1929. Huntington won back-to-back in 1916 and 17. Auburn and Central won a sectional in 1923. Central won 6 straight sectionals from 1923 to 1929. There was no state tournament for football and baseball when it started. Baseball started in 1967. Football started in 1973 statewide. We'll talk more about that as we move further along in historical videos. Talking about some early basketball history, prior to the conference's existence, just a handful of these schools have already won conference championships Kendallville won 5 straight sectionals from 1917 to 21, and again from 1926 to 31. Huntington won 9 straight sectionals from 1918 to 26, and 7 straight from 1928 to 1934. Angola won 7 basketball sectional titles between 1920 and 29. Bluffton also had a handful of those sectional titles in between during its early years of existence. In 1928, host Angola defeated Pleasant Lake 35-21 to win their own sectional. Huntington defeated Crete Township 24-22 to win the Warren sectional. Those are the first ever sectional championship teams representing the Northeast Indiana Athletic Conference. Taking a look at the first team state finalists, there were 2 representing the conference. The first being the Kendallville Red Devils in 1927-28. Back then they were called the Red Devils. Eventually they would change their name to the Comets. Based on my research, they went 20-6, 7-3 in conference. In their road to state, they defeated Albion 27-10 to win the Kendallville sectional, defeated host Auburn and Angola to win the regional, and reached the state finals. Back then in 1928, there was no semi-state. Once you won your regional, you qualified for what would eventually be like a 3-round format that became known as the state finals, the original state finals format, which you would have your Sweet 16, Elite 8, Final 4, and then the championship game thereafter. The other team was Fort Wayne Central. The Fort Wayne Central Tigers went 16-12 and 5-5 in conference. Relatively mediocre by their own standards by that point, but still caught fire at the right time. In their road to state tournament, they defeated Northside 28-11 to win the Fort Wayne sectional, defeated Bluffton and Kirkland Township to win the Fort Wayne regional, thus advancing to state. They made it to the state finals 2 times earlier in 1926 and 27. In 26, they lost to Marion 51-26 in the Elite 8. 27 lost to Bedford 30-24 in the Elite 8. After the 1928 season, Central would make 6 more state finals appearances in hoops before the school was split to Northup and Wayne in 1971. This includes winning the 1943 state championship 45-40 over Lebanon and playing for a state title in 1946, losing to Anderson 67-53. We'll talk more about that in a moment when we talk about the Fort Wayne schools departing the conference. The 1928 state finals were hosted by the Hinkle Fieldhouse, which was then known as the Butler Fieldhouse. It is still the home of Butler University basketball to this day. They hosted the annual boys basketball state finals from 1928 to 1942, and again from 1946 to 71. Hinkle also hosted girls basketball state finals from 1976 to 79, and for the 1999-2000 season. This format lasted, in terms of the state finals format back then, lasted from 1911 to 1935, which the semi-state format debuted for the 1935-36 season. In that year, 1928, Anderson, Bedford, Clinton, Columbus, Delphi, East Chicago, Washington, Evansville Central, Fort Wayne Central, Frankfort, Kendallville, Logansport, Martinsville, Muncie Central, Rochester, and Washington all played in that state finals format. Central and Kendallville lost in the Sweet 16, Central losing to Clinton by a point, and Kendallville losing to Bedford by 17 points. Muncie Central went on to win that state championship 13-12 over Martinsville. And Bluffton would go on to play for state finals as well. 1932 would see the first subtraction in the conference's history. Huntington, which was then called Huntington High School, still called the Vikings by this point, they left the conference in 1932 to join the newly formed Central Indiana Conference, also known as the CIC. When talking to some people that are still part of that Huntington community today, they have always remembered about how Huntington North loved the CIC, and rightfully so. They were one of the very first members of that conference, so they trusted what the CIC was going to be and what it has been to this very day. The original members of the CIC were Alexandria, Elwood, Huntington, Noblesville, Tipton, Wabash, and Windfall. Huntington joined that conference from 1932 until 1974, and they would spend the next 41 years hopping around several different conferences, which included the Olympic Conference and then later the North Central Conference. We'll talk more about that when we talk specifically about Huntington North's history. Huntington would later be renamed to Huntington North due to consolidation. However, the school has kept the Vikings name to this day. By this point, the NEIAC starts to expand, and something you won't see on Wikipedia is the fact that Hartford City did join this conference and saw some immediate success. 1932 saw the Hartford City Airedales joining the NEIAC. Early years saw instant success in the state in conference play and the state tournament. They were 1933 and 34 conference boys basketball champions. They were 1935 NEIAC baseball champions. During one of their runs in the state tournaments, they did lose to Logansport 21-12 in the Elite Eight. So Hartford City has made a run into the state finals before in its history. Between 1930 and 1937, they won 6 boys basketball sectional titles. They were 1934 regional champions with 31-17 win over Ossian and 32-23 win over Huntington. That was the year that they went to the state finals, lost to Logansport in the Elite Eight. Gradually, performance decline and travel cost concerns led to Hartford City's eventual departure in 1945. They would actually join the CIC that year and would become a member until it consolidated in 1968 to become what is now known as the Blackford Bruins. So for those of you that now know, how did Hartford City have these connections to CIC? Well, that's where it all began, and now the Blackford Bruins are the current tenants for the Hartford City community. The conference would go through some ups and downs during the Great Depression era, obviously some success, but also going through the hurdles of financial struggles due to the stock market crash that occurred nationwide. Auburn became the first NEIAC school to win 3 or more straight conference titles, winning 5 straight from 1929 to 33. In 1932, Southside's Jack Fleming won the 880-yard state meets. Robert Kleiner, also representing Southside, won the mile run. Also in 1932, Southside won the indoor medley relay state meets at 2 minutes and 58 seconds. They did it again in 1935, this time at 3 minutes and 1.7 seconds. By 1933, Auburn's Don Lash won the mile run state meet. Southside again won the 880-yard relay championships, as I mentioned earlier. 1934, Decatur became the first conference baseball team to win multiple titles in a row, winning 3 straight from 1932 to 34, and again from 1939 to 41. Auburn's Denzel Myers in 1934 won the shot put indoor meets in 1934 and 1935. Myers was the last state champion in that event, as it discontinued after Myers' championship in 1935. There would be more conference movement after 1934-35 as Angola and Garrett, they would jump ships to the newly formed State Corner Conference. And in that State Corner Conference, they were part of several members that were close geographically to Angola and Garrett, including Albion, Ashley, Avila, Butler, LaGrange, and Waterloo. The new conference covered DeKalb, LaGrange, Noble, and Steuben counties, although half of that conference represented DeKalb County. During the 1930s, the NEIAC would see dominance from the 3 Fort Wayne member schools. From 1934 to 1940, the NEIAC boys track title went to a Fort Wayne school. Northside won 4 of those titles. Southside won 2. Central won the 1. 1935-1940, the NEIAC basketball title went to a Fort Wayne school. Southside won it 4 times. Central won it once, which was shared with Decatur. Combined, the 3 Fort Wayne schools won 32 conference titles between its first year until the 3 schools left. Roughly 13 years later, roughly 57% of all conference championships during that point. By 1936, Fort Wayne Central's Steve Sitko named for the Mental Attitude Award for boys basketball. Staying with the 1930s, 1936, Fort Wayne Central won the 880-yard relay. The next year, Northside's Alan McMead won the 440-yard dash state finals meet. Northside was the 880-yard relay champion in 1938. And then the next year, Northside's Donald Kemp won the 880-yard run meet. By 1940, just shortly after the Fort Wayne City Series was formed in 1935, Central, Northside, Southside, seeing what was going on with that new conference, decided to depart the NEIAC after 13 years, and they would join full time with that conference in 1940, just roughly 6 years after the City Series was formed. Previously, the three schools played concurrently in both conferences from 1934 to 1940. From 1934 to 52, the conference consisted of these three schools and Fort Wayne Central Catholic, which would later be dissolved due to the growth of newer schools coming in, including Bishop Luers and Bishop Dwayner, to name a few. From 1942 to 1965, Northside actually played in two conferences after departing from the NEIC, which included the NIC. During this time in the NIC's history, they became a super conference, a conference to which stretched far beyond its limitations. And, you had schools in South Bend, you had schools in the Gary area, you had schools in Fort Wayne. It was a large, massive conference, and because of that, the NIC would eventually deal with travel issues, cost concerns, and because of the fact that the conference was taking advantage of just the fact there were so few conferences out there, they basically monopolized how many schools can come to their conference by telling them that we have this brand new innovative conference. And it was great and all, but it also led to other changes to be made, which also included the conference having to play two divisions at one point in the NIC's existence, which would last until the NIC eventually reduced its size in terms of membership. Also, from 1945 to 1947, Southside briefly played in two conferences, both between the Fort Wayne City Series and the CIC, interestingly enough. But unlike Northside, that did not last for Southside. Central did not join in any other conference other than the City Series during its remaining years. By 1952, Concordia opened its doors, which would lead to Concordia joining the conference, and in the years following would lead to rapid expansion in the 1960s and 1970s. As you can see in the bottom right, that is the Fort Wayne Central team that won a state championship in 1943, which would lead to Central having a nice run of success in basketball. Garrett obviously would come back to the conference roughly 6 years after competing in the state corner conference. Just 6 years later, Garrett is a part of the NEIAC once again, and this would last for another 40 years. Garrett will only build off of their success in the state corner and enjoy a nice 40-year run in the conference. Garrett will remain as a member until 1981 when Garrett departs for the NECC. We'll talk more about that later on in this history video. In 1941, Decatur earned an NEIAC baseball three-peat. 1942, NEIAC's first three-team share in basketball occurred with Auburn, Columbia City, and Hartford City. Because of World War II occurring, some sports were interrupted because of that. Obviously, baseball was one of them. We'll talk about that in a moment. But by the end of World War II, the NEIC starts expanding again. This time, they bring the Warsaw Tigers to the NEIC after spending 12 years in the CIC. Warsaw's presence would be known early and often, winning 12 combined conference championships, 5 coming in football. In 1946, the New Haven Bulldogs joined the NEIC after spending the first 2 decades as an independent. New Haven spent many years competing against Fort Wayne schools, as well as competing in what was then known as the Allen County Basketball Tournament. Eventually, with New Haven joining the NEIC, brought a new era of New Haven athletics, and eventually a long-term relationship with many of the founding schools of that conference. As I mentioned earlier, Decatur baseball recorded 3 straight conference titles in 1941. Because of World War II, it halted the NEIAC baseball race for the next 3 seasons. By 1946, Auburn became the first NEIAC basketball program to win 3 straight conference titles. Auburn became the first boys track conference member since 1933 to win 4 straight of these conference titles. By 1947, the NEIAC fielded boys cross country for the first time, with Decatur winning the inaugural meet. And in 1949, Auburn's James Schooley, was named the Mental Attitude Award winner. In 1950, Decatur won an NEIAC record 6 straight baseball titles. The next year, Auburn completed their 6th straight football conference title. Between 1940 and 51, Auburn won 9 conference titles in that sport. Kendallville won their 3rd straight conference cross-country meet that fall, and then in 1952, near the end of their run in the NEIAC, Warsaw won their 5th straight football conference title, shared the conference in 4 of them, and then won 4 straight in track. By 1954, New Haven's Ronald Huffer won the 100-yard dash at 10.1 seconds, as well as the 220-yard dash at 22 seconds in the state finals meets. New Haven as a team placed 6th in that state finals track meets. In 1955, the NEIAC fielded boys golf, where Garrett won the first 3 conference championships. And during this point in 1955, expansion / subtraction / a lot of changes would occur with the conference once again. 1953, Warsaw departed the NEIC after a successful 8-year run to rejoin the CIC. This would last for another decade until they left to join the newly formed Northern Lakes Conference, aka the NLC, in 1963, to which Warsaw has remained a member there ever since. In that same year, the Auburn Red Devils also left to become an independent school. By that point, the DeKalb County Pod was already dissolved. You still had the State Corner Conference going around during this time. Auburn became an independent, but that wouldn't last too long. By 1955, the Concordia Lutheran Cadets, only 3 years into their existence, joined the NEIAC after spending its first 3 years exclusively with the Fort Wayne City Series. Don't worry, that relationship with the Fort Wayne City Series will not disappear for much longer. From 1955 to 1965, Concordia exclusively competed in this conference, later concurrently played in both this conference and the City Series, which would later be named the SAC from then on until their departure 20 years later at this point. Expansion would continue into the late 50s. Angola returns to the NEIAC after independence / playing in the Steuben County Pod. Elmhurst would soon follow. 1958, Angola, who had already left the State Corner Conference 17 years prior to join the Steuben County Pod, they would spend another 17 years in the Steuben County Pod, then return to the NEIAC in 1958. Unfortunately, due to scheduling conflicts, Angola would not be able to join the football conference until 1960. In that same year, the Fort Wayne Elmhurst Trojans joined the conference after spending 4 successful years in the ACAC. Elmhurst would soon find themselves rekindling with the other Fort Wayne schools to be part of that original SAC membership. As high school sports shift to the 1960s, the days of county pods will soon come to an end. Consolidation will play a major role in the realignment of established conferences and the explosion of new conferences. With new conferences come new competition and more pressure on these larger, more established conferences to adapt to the changing times. With these additions, the NEIAC enters the 1960s with 9 members. And lo and behold, in 1960, they kick off a new decade with Auburn returning. I told you this wouldn't last. 1959, Concordia's Steve Hibbler won the mile run state meet. Following the next fall, New Haven's boys cross country team placed as state finals runners-ups, as New Haven would have a nice run of cross country success throughout the early 1960s. In that same year, Auburn rejoined the NEIAC after spending 7 years as an independent, but that won't last too long, as consolidation will soon take shape of modern-day athletics. This move adds the conference membership to 10 teams and also marks the beginning of several changes that soon followed. Also in 1960, New Haven earned a 4-peat in baseball, their first in a decade. New Haven became the first boys cross-country team that fall to win a sectional. Jump ahead to 1963, Auburn won their 3rd straight boys golf title. And then the next track season, 1964, New Haven's Don Orsdale won the pole vault state meet at 13 feet and 6 inches. Expansion is going to continue by 1965 as they expand further south of Decatur, and Bern becomes part of the NEIAC map. With the pending an imminent change of high school sports due to consolidation. 1965 was the year that the Bern Bears joined the NEIAC after 12 combined years competing in the Eastern Indiana Conference and the Eastern Wabash Valley Conference. EIC membership for Bern lasted from 1953 to 1959, and again from 1962 to 1965. They were a member of the Eastern Wabash Valley Conference, from 1959 to 1962. Bern was an original member of both conferences. This move reunites natural rivalries with Decatur and Bluffton, and now the conference membership increases to 11, but that's not going to last long. Staying with the 1960s, 1965, the first year to find anything regarding boys wrestling. I'm not sure why there's a basketball logo there, just ignore that. Decatur won the first 2 titles for boys wrestling, and as Decatur will soon be consolidated, the school that would eventually succeed Decatur would have a dominant run of wrestling for the next 6 decades plus, which is still continuing here in 2024. It was also the first year to find anything regarding the NEIC's boys tennis history, with Concordia winning their first of 3 straight conference titles. Concordia Wrestling would follow Decatur's success by winning 3 of the next 4 conference wrestling titles before Concordia eventually leaves the conference, and then Belmont would take over the dominance of the sport. By 1966, during Auburn's last years as a school, they became the first conference boys golf team to win a sectional. In 1966, consolidation once again takes a huge part of conference changes, and the NEIAC will not be excluded to that impact. Consolidation dominoes continue to fall in 1966, with 2 separate consolidations occurring. Starting with Noble County, the Kendallville Comets consolidated with the Rome City Romans and the Avila Panthers, who were a part of the State Corner Conference, and they became the East Noble Knights, a prominent school with a lot of success in basketball and later in football, as well as tennis, cross country, track, and you name it. East Noble had a very good run early and would become one of the dominant and prime members to what would become now known as the NE8. South to Adams County, the Bern Bears consolidated with the Geneva Cardinals, and they became the South Adams Starfires. League membership shrunk to 10 teams due to these changes in 1966, especially as Elmhurst leaves the NEIAC and becomes a member of what would soon be called the SAC. As you're going to see throughout the NEIC's existence, South Adams is not going to receive a lot of success during this run in the conference, but would build the path and build the stages for future success past the NEIC's existence. Elmhurst left the NEIC to rejoin the Fort Wayne City Series and would become one of the founding members of the SAC. 1967, Columbia City and Garrett became the first conference baseball programs to win a sectional title. 1968, East Noble's Gary Thrapp won the pole vault state meet at 15 feet and 0.5 inches. From 1968 to 1970, Belmont baseball went on to win 3 straight sectionals and would also win the 1968 regional championship. Going back to 1967, Columbia City would make a run to the state finals, one of the first ever state tournaments. In fact, this was the first baseball state tournament in 50 years. Yes, the IHSAA did not have baseball for 50 years in the state tournament, and it brought back in 1967. Columbia City is a part of that first state tournament in 5 decades. On the season, they went 15-6, 6-3 in the conference. In the sectionals, they defeated Huntertown 15-3 to win the Columbia City sectional. In regionals, Columbia City defeated rivals Garrett and Leo to win the Columbia City regional. And then in semi-state, they defeated Madison Heights and Richmond to win the Anderson semi-state. In the state semifinals, hosted by Victory Field, which would later be renamed to Busch Stadium, the home of the Indianapolis Indians, Columbia City lost to eventual state champions LaPorte 8-2. And not too long after that state finals run, consolidation is going to impact the conference once again. And by 1967, Two more schools are impacted and would lead to further changes with the conference. 1967, two more schools were impacted by rapid trends of consolidation. First, beginning with the Decatur Yellow Jackets, one of the original members of the NEIAC. They consolidated with the Decatur Catholic Commodores and the Monmouth Eagles to become the Belmont Braves, who become still, to this day, one of the Big Six member schools who have been there from the very beginning to today with the NEAs. In DeKalb County, the Auburn Red Devils, the Ashley Aces, and the Waterloo Wildcats, they all consolidated to become the DeKalb Barons. DeKalb would have an immediate impact on the conference, would win conference championships early and often, and would eventually find success in the state tournament. We'll talk more about that later. Staying with the late 1960s, by 1968, Concordia became the first conference wrestling team to win a sectional. The next season, Belmont's Phil Langerich became the first NEIC wrestler to win state in the 138-pound state bracket by a technical fall at the 3-minute 55-second mark by defeating Tom Crawford of Speedway. This is not the first time or last time that you're going to hear about Belmont winning a state championship in wrestling. It's going to happen a lot. Don't be surprised. In 1970, New Haven became the first conference wrestling team to win a regional, although in a rare title share with Concord. Title shares do not happen very often, and this is one of the very few times that it's ever happened in the history of the wrestling state tournament. In 1971, East Noble only being a school for 5 years, they became the first conference boys golf team to win a sectional. Belmont won their first sectional in 1972 in wrestling and would become a regular winner in the state tournament, as I mentioned just moments earlier. In 1972, jumping ahead about 2 or 3 years later, the South Adams Starfires, one of the few very strong moments in their history in the NEIC, would see the South Adams Starfires make an impressive run to the state finals. On the season, they went 22-5. They defeated Belmont in sectionals 7-4, which they were a powerhouse back in the 70s. In regionals, they defeated Muncie Central and Richmond to win the regional. I believe that was still hosted by Columbia City at the time. And then in semi-state, they defeated Maconaquah and Kokomo to make it to the state finals. In the state semifinals at Busch Stadium, they shut out Boonville 4-0. And then the state championship game, they were shut out by Bloomington South by the score of 3-0. They would have a kid with the last name of Neuschwander, and Doug Neuschwander, I believe is the one I'm talking about. He would go on to have a professional career after high school, still playing baseball. Alan Beitler was named the Mental Attitude Award for the sport as South Adams concluded a successful and memorable run in baseball. By this point in 1972 came the birth of female sports. Title IX was enacted, providing equal funding and opportunities for women's sports. I mentioned this in the NECC video. If you haven't seen that one, please click on the NECC history video, the very first one, because I do talk a little bit more in depth about Title IX, but I just want to make sure this is addressed here at this moment. 1971, Garrett's Jeff Stroman won the first of two straight 120-yard high hurdle state meets. As you can see on the slide, 1971, Stroman recorded a time of 14.4 seconds. The next year, just a little bit better, 14.2 seconds. In 1972, Stroman was named the Mental Attitude Award for boys track. And as we talk more about Garrett's history, we'll talk more about Jeff Stroman as an individual. He became one of the most decorated athletes to ever represent the Garrett Railroaders. Also in 1971, DeKalb's Ken Wilson won the 180-yard hurdles in the state meet at 19.4 seconds. In 1973, Bluffton recorded a three-peat in boys tennis. That's not going to last. Also in 1973, Concordia's Arthur Scherer, I hope I'm saying the name right, named the Mental Attitude Award for boys tennis. 1974, the conference fielded girls volleyball for the first time. Belmont, unsurprisingly, won the first of 4 straight volleyball titles. And as we go through the history of the conference and the conferences that soon succeeded this one, Belmont is going to be a common opponent that's going to win this conference a lot in volleyball. So I think that's going to do it for the first part of the NEIC's history video. In our next video, we will talk about the remaining years of the NEIC, as we will talk in a very heavy amount of detail about the 1980s, talking about what went down that led to the conference's departure. Until next time, so long.